I've been a news vendor for over 20 years. My name is Michael, and I know New York like the back of my hand. Every day, I wake up before the sun rises and head to the newsstand at the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. The streets of Manhattan, still asleep, stretch out like a deserted carpet before me. Only the distant sound of cars passing along 6th Avenue and the occasional murmur of the subway break the dawn's silence. It's a routine I'm familiar with, a tranquility that, in some way, has always comforted me. But that morning, things wouldn't be so normal. The city still slept beneath the shadow of skyscrapers, and the Empire State Building, in the distance, seemed to keep a cold and distant watch over everything. The lights of Times Square were dimmer than usual, as if the city were holding its breath. The grand hotels, like the Plaza Hotel, cast heavy shadows over the avenue, keeping their secrets behind walls that had seen both luxury and despair. I began to open the stand, organizing the newspapers and magazines as always. That's when I saw him for the first time. Across the street, standing almost melded into the shadows cast by the buildings, was a man. He didn't look like a homeless person nor someone searching for a morning read. There was something about him that made me stop for a moment. He wore an old time-worn suit and a felt hat, not something common around here. He looked at me, or rather, he seemed to look through me as if he saw something beyond what my eyes could comprehend. I tried to ignore the stranger's presence, chalking him up as one of the many eccentric figures you can find in New York. But the discomfort persisted. The man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, observing me. The morning dragged on, and gradually the first customers began to arrive. They greeted me, bought their papers, but I could feel the weight of that unrelenting gaze, even without looking directly at him. Eventually, I decided to confront the situation. After some time, I noticed that he was holding something. It seemed to be an old edition of a newspaper, so worn that the date was barely legible. Intrigued, I crossed the street to ask if he wanted to buy anything, but as soon as my feet touched the sidewalk on the other side, the man disappeared. What hit me wasn't relief, but a cold, cutting fear that climbed up my spine like an icy blade. Back at my stand, I tried to focus on my tasks, but my thoughts were clouded, and my mind was restless. The following days were worse. I began to notice details that had previously escaped me. The street vendors along 5th Avenue seemed to give me strange looks, as if they knew something I didn't. The doors of the shops and cafes, like the famous Magnolia Bakery, seemed to close unusually fast when I passed by. Even the tourists, always with cameras pointed at iconic landmarks, avoided crossing my path. Then it happened for the first time. While arranging the papers one morning, something bizarre caught my attention. On every headline, a looming tragedy stared back at me from the pages. News vendor found dead at stand in New York, one read. Another, more sinister. News vendor mysteriously disappears in Manhattan. My fingers began to tremble, and the letters seemed to dance on the page, forming a horrifying prophecy. Panic gripped me, and I blinked, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. When a customer called out to me, I looked at the papers again. The headlines had returned to normal, but the feeling of despair lingered. From that day on, the man in the suit began to appear more frequently. He would appear out of nowhere, suddenly standing at the corner of 42nd Street, watching me from across the street. Once, I saw him reflected in the glass of a nearby restaurant, the Grand Central Oyster Bar, as I closed up the stand. When I turned to face him, he was gone. Yet the terror didn't disappear. I began to carry with me a constant fear, a sense that something horrible was about to happen. The following week, after another long day, I decided to walk to Bryant Park, trying to clear my head. The leaves on the trees swayed gently in the wind, and the park was relatively calm, considering the usual hustle. But as I turned into one of the paths between the gardens, there he was. The man in the suit. This time he was closer. He handed me another newspaper. With trembling hands, I opened it, and the headline hit me like a punch to the gut. News vendor dies of heart attack near Bryant Park. I was paralyzed. The man disappeared into the crowd before I could react. Dazed, I walked back to 5th Avenue. Fear stalked me around every corner, and every time I looked back, I felt as if he was getting closer. The next morning, as I opened the stand, I found yet another mysterious paper among the stacks. The headline read, "News vendor found dead at his own stand." My heart raced, and the people around me seemed to watch me with a mix of pity and curiosity. I started avoiding direct looks at the headlines, afraid of what they might reveal. The torment continued. He appeared at unexpected moments. Once, while I was crossing the Brooklyn Bridge on my way home, a man emerged from the other end with his old suit and the yellowed newspaper in his hands. Another time, I saw him inside a subway station, standing in the shadows. Each time he appeared, the headlines changed, always suggesting a terrible end for me. One night, as I walked home after yet another dark day, I felt a presence behind me. I quickened my pace through the empty streets. The lights of the city that never sleeps seemed distant, and the sound of my footsteps echoed down the sidewalk. As I rounded a corner, the presence felt even closer. I looked back, and there he was, holding the newspaper like a trophy. I tried to run, but stumbled over an invisible stone and fell to the ground. When I got up, he had disappeared, but the newspaper was there, lying on the ground before me. I picked it up, my heart racing, and read the headline: News vendor dies in mysterious attack in New York. Since then, I've lived under the shadow of that headline. Every morning, as I open the stand, my heart skips a beat, expecting to see yet another prophecy of my demise. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know somehow there's no escape. Death is lurking, hidden in the shadows of the city, and I can only wait for it.
I was born and raised in Bangkok, the city that never sleeps. My roots are planted deep in its crowded streets, golden temples, and night markets that seem to have a life of their own. My family follows Buddhist traditions strictly, but for me, these traditions have always been more of an inheritance than a belief. I work as a tour guide during the day, leading foreigners through the narrow alleys and the vibrant chaos of Khao San Road, telling stories about the Grand Palace and Wat Po Temple. At night, I seek peace in the solitude of my small apartment near the Chao Phraya River, where the city's lights blend with the smell of incense and street food. Recently, something strange started happening to me. It began when one of the tourists asked me about the Phai Pop, a local legend of a malevolent spirit that, according to belief, possesses people and makes them devour human flesh. I laughed it off at the time, saying it was just a story to scare the superstitious, something even children avoided mentioning. But that man, with sunken, serious eyes, insisted. He spoke of a recent case, a body found without entrails in a small village up north, and how the villagers believed the Phai Pop had returned. I felt uneasy, but I went on with my life as usual. That night, in my apartment, a strange heaviness settled over me. It was as if something was watching me, as if the walls had eyes. I tried to push the thought away, but the silence became oppressive. I turned on the TV to drown out the sound of my own breathing, and then I heard it. A subtle noise coming from the corner of my room, like something shifting behind the wooden screen that separated my bed from the rest of the apartment. I convinced myself it was just the creaking of old furniture and tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. The following days were worse. I started waking up in the middle of the night, tasting metal in my mouth. One morning, while reaching for my phone on the bedside table, I found a small, dried flower, crumpled and brown with age, lying beside it. It looked like one of the jasmine flowers from the offerings I sometimes left at a shrine down the road, but I hadn't visited it in weeks. I threw it away, assuming it was just an old keepsake I had forgotten about. One night, while walking down Salam Road after taking a group of tourists to the Sky Bar, I noticed I was being followed. A shadow, faceless, formless, always present but never clear enough to be seen directly. I turned around several times, trying to catch a glimpse, but there was nothing. Only a chill running down my spine and the sound of footsteps echoing in the dark alleys. I rushed home, not daring to look back. However, when I stepped into my apartment, something was off. The scent of incense and street food had vanished. The air was thick, filled with something rotten. I went to the bathroom to wash my face, trying to shake off the fear. When I opened the door, the flower was back. The same brittle, dried jasmine flower, lying in the middle of the tiled floor. My heart raced. I knew for sure I had thrown it away. I picked it up with trembling hands and threw it out again. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of exhaustion. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from beneath the bed, persistent, insistent. I froze, listening. The noise was rhythmic, like nails scraping wood. It stopped just as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a suffocating silence. That night, I decided to leave Bangkok for a few days. I took a bus to Ayutthaya, the ancient capital, hoping the tranquility of the ruined temples would calm me. I arrived in the afternoon, and the place was silent, empty. As I walked through the ruins, I began to feel something strange. When I looked back, there it was. The shadow, motionless but watching. I ran, but my feet sank into the earth as if the ground was giving way. The temple ahead of me seemed to distort, and then everything went black. I woke up in my apartment in Bangkok. My heart was racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a nightmare, but something was wrong. My feet were covered in dirt. The taste of blood was stronger in my mouth, as if I had fed on something. I turned to look at my bedside table, and there it was again, the flower. Fresh now, vibrant white, as though newly plucked. The scent of jasmine filled the air, sweet and sickening. And then I felt it, the shift in the room. A weight, a presence, heavy and oppressive. I wasn't alone anymore. Something stood behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. I heard a whisper, soft, distant, but unmistakable. A name I didn't recognize. The air grew cold as the flower crumbled to dust in my hand. I couldn't run anymore.
I've always had a strange relationship with the subway. The flickering lights, the noise of the trains rushing through the tunnels like steel worms devouring the underground. But living in London, the subway is an unavoidable part of life. That night, too late to get a taxi, I found myself descending the old stairs of Ravenscourt Park, a station dating back to the 19th century, loaded with history, but now more known for its decaying appearance. There was something different about it that night, something I had never felt before, a weight in the air that put me on alert. Maybe it was the exhaustion. It was late and I was coming back from an art exhibition in Soho, something that should have relaxed me, but instead had the opposite effect. The paintings, distorted portraits of human figures, were imprinted in my mind. The shadows in the brushstrokes seemed to follow me. I descended to the platform and looked around. There were only a few scattered passengers, tired like me. The tiled floor was damp, the ancient ceiling covered in stains from leaks. Ravenscourt Park was one of London's oldest stations, built in 1873, part of the oldest subway system in the world. They say that during World War II, civilians used that station as a shelter from German bombings, sleeping in the cold and damp while the city burned above them. I never liked thinking about it, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of history in that place. As I waited, I heard a strange sound, like the distant echo of footsteps, but there was no one nearby. The train was late, an annoying but common fact. I checked my phone. No signal. One thing I've never fully understood is how the signal can disappear in a tunnel, especially in the modernized parts. Still, there I was, isolated. When the train finally arrived, something made me hesitate before getting on. The carriage was empty, which was unusual for that hour. All the others on the platform had vanished. I don't remember seeing them board another carriage. This should have alarmed me, but I stepped inside, ignoring the discomfort lodged in my mind. The doors closed with a muffled clank, and the train began to move. The first few minutes were normal. The noise of the wheels on the track and the dim lights were almost comforting. But then the carriage started to shake, violently and out of rhythm. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, they went completely out. When they came back on, I felt the air change. A strong, pungent smell of rusted metal filled the air, mixed with something else, something wet. I was no longer alone. In the reflection of the window, I saw a hunched figure at the far end of the carriage. My breath caught in my throat. It was an indistinct silhouette, a human crouched, almost reptilian in its posture. I tried to turn to get a better look, but my muscles were locked. The train sped up, shaking violently from side to side. The sound of the figure moving across the carriage was a mix of scraping and thudding, like something heavy being dragged. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. Tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just exhaustion, a hallucination. Perhaps the trauma of seeing those disturbing paintings earlier had affected me more than I wanted to admit. But then the train stopped. I looked out the window and saw we were in the middle of the tunnel. External lights were off. Whatever was happening, it was very real. I started hearing a low, growing sound, whispers. But it wasn't just one sound. It was like dozens of voices echoing through the tunnel, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I began to feel the carriage grow colder, and when I looked down, the floor was covered in a thin layer of dirty, oily water. I knew about the floods that occurred in London's underground tunnels. Some stories claimed that the ancient drainage systems, not built to withstand modern pressures, occasionally flooded the older lines. But this felt different. It was as if the carriage was slowly sinking into something deeper, something untouched by any modern subway. The voices grew louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I looked to the side, and the reflection in the glass made me gasp. It wasn't me. The person reflected had my clothes, my hair, but the face was distorted, as if it had been crushed, flattened at impossible angles. A scream caught in my throat, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then the train started moving again, but faster than before. The tunnel lights flashed like camera flashes, briefly illuminating grotesque scenes, piled bodies, torn clothes like ghosts of bombing victims. Memories of the station being used as a wartime shelter resurfaced. The doors of the carriage began to open and close as if some invisible force was controlling them. When we finally stopped at a station I didn't recognize, I dragged myself out. The walls were covered in dirty, wet handprints, as if something had tried to climb out of the depths. The floor was packed earth, not tiles. I looked at the station sign, hoping for some clarity. It read Ravenscross, a name I had never heard of. This couldn't be real. There was a sound behind me, a sharp screech like metal being scratched. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the tunnel disappearing into the darkness. Only then did I notice that the whispering had stopped. I stood there trying to steady my breath, trying to understand what had just happened. Took a few steps back, ready to run, when I noticed something strange. The water on the floor was rising again, faster this time, and the walls began to close in as if the tunnel itself was alive, as if it wanted to swallow me. I ran, but the feeling of being pursued never went away. The air grew heavier as if something invisible was pressing down on me. I could hear the thudding of something in the walls, following my steps. With every meter, the sound grew louder, closer. I knew I had to reach the surface, but the tunnels stretched ahead of me like an endless maze. I turned a corner and suddenly stopped. In front of me, the tunnel simply ended. The brick wall was solid, with no exit in sight. I was trapped. The sound behind me grew louder, a cacophony of whispers and thuds threatening to drive me insane. Then I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned quickly, and what I saw, I can't describe. A formless mass made of shadows and remains, as if all the lost souls in those tunnels had merged into a single entity. Its hands, if they could be called that, were covered in decomposed flesh, remnants of ancient passengers, trapped in an endless cycle of death and pain. I had nowhere left to run. The thing approached slowly, its putrid smell enveloping me, and I knew, in that moment, there was no escape. Before I could scream, it engulfed me completely, pulling me into its cold, suffocating embrace. My lungs burned and the darkness began to close around me. In the last second, when all seemed lost, something happened. I was back on the platform at Ravenscourt Park. The train was stopped in front of me, its doors open as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't the same place. The people around me were pale, transparent. Their faces distorted like those of the figures in the carriage. I looked down at my hands, and they were disintegrating, like wet paper. Reality crumbled around me. I wanted to scream, but my voice vanished into the void, swallowed by the distant sound of a train that would never arrive.